2:30 p.m., a suburb of Buenos Aires. The duty station receives a call from residents of a neighboring house. The reason is loud music coming from a private house at San Ramon Street, number 18. A patrol car is dispatched. 2 officers, a typical daytime assignment. The log records the entry, complaint about a breach of public order. Everything looks routine, like hundreds of similar calls received every week. The neighborhood is quiet, mostly retirees and middle-class families. Narrow streets, dense housing, small courtyards, fences with peeling paint. House number 18 does not stand out. Grey walls, old shutters, a well-kept front garden. From inside, loud music is indeed heard, an old Argentinian tango, a typical melody from the 70s. A woman appears at the doorstep. Later identified as Isabel Rodriguez, 68 years old. Neatly dressed, she speaks politely without signs of agitation. She apologizes, explaining that she was listening to old recordings of her husband, who recently passed away. She speaks calmly, confidently. At first glance, a friendly elderly homeowner, a typical representative of the older generation. She immediately turns off the music, promising that it won't happen again. The officers are already preparing to leave, but one of them notices that it is too stuffy inside the house. The windows are tightly closed, the curtains drawn, even though it is a hot day outside. A heavy smell hangs in the house, a mixture of dampness and cleaning products. It's a minor detail, but it raises a red flag. As they head towards the exit, a short, muffled sound comes from deep inside the house, not like footsteps, more like a thump or a falling object. Isabel reacts instantly. She says it's the pipes. The house is old, it's always noisy. Her explanation sounds calm but too quick. One of the officers decides to check. He asks for permission to inspect the house. The woman hesitates but agrees. They pass through a narrow corridor. Old family photographs hang on the walls. Most of the pictures show Isabel, a middle-aged man, and several younger women. Further on is the living room, clean and tidy, but as if it hasn't been used in a long time. Everything is in its place. Not a single misplaced item. One of the officers notices a door at the end of the corridor, a metal handle, fresh screwdriver marks, and most importantly, a lock, installed on the outside. A regular surface-mounted lock, but on the exterior side of the door. This looks strange. He stops, examines the door, then turns to the homeowner. "What room is this?" "The bathroom," she replies. "It's being renovated." The answer sounds casual, but it doesn't convince him. Old paint stains are visible on the floor next to the door, but there's no smell of renovation. His partner moves closer, putting his ear to the door. A barely audible sound is heard from inside. It's unclear what it is. It could be breathing. It could be footsteps. From this moment, the situation ceases to be routine. The officers call for backup and inform the dispatcher that they intend to open the door. Isabel tries to object, saying it's private property, but her voice sounds increasingly unsure. When the door is opened, the air in the house seems to freeze. A cold, damp smell escapes from inside. The room is small, without windows. On the floor, an old mattress, a bucket, a plastic bowl of water. A woman sits by the wall, very thin, in old clothes with long, tangled hair. She covers her eyes from the light and says not a word. The patrol calls medics. The woman identifies herself as Lucia. According to her, she has been living here for 4 years. Isabel Rodriguez stands motionless at this moment. No scream, no attempt to flee. Only one short sentence said softly, "She was sick. I was helping her." At this stage, the story ceases to be a domestic matter. An investigation begins, which will soon show that much more than just renovation was hidden behind that door. While doctors provide assistance to the found woman, investigators draw up initial reports. During the inspection, the identity of the homeowner is established. According to documents, Inés Ramirez, 68 years old, a native of Santa Fe province, a widow. For the past 20 years, she had lived alone in this house. Her pension is received regularly, and there are no utility debts. In the eyes of her neighbors, a quiet, withdrawn but polite woman. She often sat in the yard, pruned roses, greeted everyone, but did not socialize closely with anyone. Then the identity of the second woman found behind the locked door is established. Her passport was in a drawer in the living room. Name: Sofia Alvarez, 26 years old. The photo on the document matches the appearance of the victim. The signature on the passport is neat even, but noticeably old, clearly made many years ago. The very first database queries yield an unexpected result. According to information from the Missing Persons Department, Sofia has been listed as missing since June 1998. The report was filed by her mother, who lives in another city. The case file states, last contact, a visit to a maternal relative, connection lost after that. And now, 4 years later, this same relative stands before the investigators in the same house where the missing person was found. Officially, Inés Ramirez did not feature in the case all this time. No mentions, no interrogations. Her name appeared only once, as a contact person for clarifying details. When investigators ask how it happened that her niece was in her house, Inés simply replies, "She was sick. I was taking care of her." She says this calmly, without a hint of embarrassment. Her speech is coherent, her intonations confident. But the more the police listen, the more obvious it becomes that her story does not match what they see at the scene. Empty medicine packages are found in the kitchen, all with expired dates, in the bathroom, traces under the lock, which was installed not from the inside, but from the outside of the door. The lock is new, with no signs of rust, indicating that it was used recently. Based on the inspection, one thing is clear: the care version does not hold up. Doctors record severe exhaustion and signs of prolonged confinement in Sofia. On her hands, pressure marks from ropes or bracelets, left not from fresh wounds, but from a long-standing habit of fixing her hands in one position. After this, the police return to the documents. It is important for them to understand how two people could live in one house, and no one noticed. The neighbors partially provide the answer. According to them, Inés rarely went out. Sometimes she took out the trash. Sometimes she went to the store, but almost always at the same time. She did not receive guests and never opened the gate to strangers. The light in the house always came on in the same rooms. In the back of the house, where the bathroom was located, the windows were boarded up from the inside. These details form a picture that can no longer be attributed to the eccentricity of an elderly character. The house, which seemed ordinary, turns out to be an isolated space where something systematic and hidden had been happening for several years. By this point, investigators make the first official notation. The found woman is the same Sofia Alvarez, who had been listed as missing for 4 years. This means, legally, she had been considered disappeared all this time. Formally, this means one thing. Inés Ramirez not only failed to report her niece's whereabouts, but deliberately concealed her. From this moment, the case status changes. From a routine check on a complaint, it moves into the category of a criminal investigation. Now it's not about disturbing the neighbor's peace. This is a case of unlawful detention, possibly linked to a deeper history. The investigation will have to understand why Inés kept silent all this time and what exactly was happening in her house. When the investigation reached a dead end in its search for motives, the investigator decided to return to the simplest thing: documents. Financial checks often reveal what is not visible in behavior or words. The request to the social services was a standard procedure. It was necessary to find out if Sofia had received any payments before her disappearance. The answer came 3 days later and immediately changed the course of the investigation. It turned out that Sofia was registered and received state disability benefits. Payments were assigned even before her disappearance, due to an injury sustained in her youth. This money was deposited into her account monthly. At the time of her disappearance, it was about 18,000 pesos a month. Not a lot, but significant support for someone without a regular income. The strangest thing was that, according to bank statements, the payments did not stop even after Sofia was declared missing. Every month, an amount was deposited into the account and almost immediately withdrawn in cash. The banking operations looked so routine that for 4 years, no one noticed the anomaly. The investigator requested camera footage from recent months, as well as copies of powers of attorney for withdrawing funds. The answer from the bank came the next day. According to the documents, the operations were indeed not carried out by Sofia herself. The money was regularly withdrawn by power of attorney, issued in the name of Inés Ramirez. The signature on the documents matched. Her handwriting was verified by experts. There was no doubt. Inés had been receiving her niece's money all this time, literally from the moment of her disappearance. This discovery completely changed the picture. If previously the investigation viewed Inés as a fanatic who acted out of conviction, now a second layer emerged: material interest. It turned out that over 4 years she had withdrawn a sum equivalent to approximately 800,000 pesos. And all this time, she officially listed Sofia as living abroad. Moreover, during the search of the house, a folder with receipts was found where Inés meticulously recorded the dates of deposits and withdrawal amounts. There wasn't a single skipped line in her records. Everything was kept accurately, pedantically, like an accounting report. This suggested not randomness, but systematic action. Financial experts compiled a summary. All funds were used for utility payments, house repairs, and Inés's personal expenses. No traces of transfers, donations, or expenses related to Sofia's treatment were found. Now the investigators saw 2 lines of motivation before them. The first, religious, built on a distorted idea of purification. The second, financial, based on simple, mercenary interest. These 2 lines together created a complex, contradictory portrait of a woman capable of justifying her actions with faith, yet acting with cold calculation. The prosecutor's office added a supplement to the indictment. An accusation of fraud and embezzlement of funds was added to the article on unlawful deprivation of liberty. Legally, this strengthened the prosecution's position, but psychologically, it made the case even more confusing. Now the investigation had to understand what was primary in Inés's actions: fanaticism or money. Because the answer to this question depended on the entire subsequent investigation, including the penalty and the classification of the crime. The case ceased to be just a story about locked doors. It became a story about the dual nature of human evil, when faith and profit intertwine so much that one cannot be separated from the other. After the investigators obtained financial evidence and identified the religious motive, the main question remained: did Inés Ramirez understand what she was doing? Or was everything that happened in that house the result of a mental disorder that deprived her of the ability to account for her own actions? To answer this, the court ordered a comprehensive psychological and psychiatric examination. Such checks are rarely conducted in Argentina and are considered decisive in complex cases. Everything depends on the specialist's conclusion. Either the person is deemed insane and sent for treatment, or they are tried on general grounds. In Inés's case, the examination became a key element of the defense. Her lawyer insisted that his client did not understand reality and acted under the influence of delusional religious beliefs. A commission of 3 experts studied Inés for more than a month. She underwent a series of interviews, psychological tests, emotional response checks, and her behavior during interrogations was observed. Inez did not resist, did not argue, and readily answered questions. She calmly spoke about her actions, showing neither anxiety nor regret. At the same time, she never got confused in the details. Every answer was clear, thoughtful, with internal logic. This alarmed the experts. The Commission's report noted that Inez displayed a stable system of religious beliefs with signs of a delusional disorder. In other words, she indeed had a distorted perception of reality. She viewed events through the prism of mystical ideas. However, she fully retained her ability to reason and control. She understood where she was, whom she was speaking to, and what consequences might follow. The chief expert of the Commission, Dr. Lucia Mendoza, formulated it this way: Inez Ramirez has a mental disorder, but she is not in a state of psychosis. She was aware of the factual nature of her actions and could control them. This conclusion was a turning point. It shattered the defense line built on the idea of insanity. From the court's perspective, a person can be a believer, a fanatic, even misguided. But if they understand that they are committing unlawful acts, they are responsible. This was exactly the case with Inez. She knew she was locking up her niece, understood it was illegal, but justified herself with the inner conviction that she was doing good. The experts thoroughly described her psychological portrait. According to them, Inez was not aggressive, did not take pleasure in control or power. Her actions were determined not by cruelty, but by conviction. She believed she was fulfilling a mission, and any suffering inflicted on others she viewed as a necessary sacrifice. This made her no less dangerous than a person with cold calculation. The psychiatrists indicated that her behavior was typical of people with religious obsessive ideas. At the same time, at the moment of her actions, she remained conscious, capable of assessing the consequences. She had no psychosis, hallucinations, or loss of contact with reality, meaning, in a legal sense, she was sane. The official verdict of the Commission was short: sane, can understand the nature and social danger of her actions. For the investigation, this was final confirmation. The defense would no longer be able to shift to a diagnosis. The case returns to the legal plane, where actions are evaluated, not thoughts. From this moment, Inez's story ceased to be a matter of psychiatry. It became a matter of morality and law. All that remained was to prove how faith, fear, and personal gain intertwined into one. Investigators knew. Ahead was the final stage, where every detail of her past would be dissected. During one of the subsequent interrogations, Inez unexpectedly mentions a name that had not been heard in any protocol before. She speaks of a certain Mateo. According to her, he was the cause of all of Sofia's troubles. In her narrative, this man is presented almost as a symbol of evil. She calls him the devil, the tempter, and the fool. The investigator notes this name in the protocol because for the first time, Inez points to someone specific other than herself and her niece. Inez claims that Sofia changed after meeting this man, that she stopped going to church, became different. She says this with such certainty, as if she is not talking about a real person, but about an enemy who destroyed the order of her world. For the investigators, this is the first clue pointing to a possible external influence. If Inez is telling the truth, Mateo could have been not just a reason, but a participant in the whole story. The police request his data and, within a few days, locate him. Mateo lives in another district, works as a car mechanic. He doesn't hide and calmly agrees to a meeting. From the very first minutes, it becomes clear. His story is completely different. He doesn't avoid conversation, doesn't make excuses. He tells everything clearly, without excessive emotion. According to Mateo, he and Sofia met almost a year before her disappearance. Their relationship was ordinary, They met, went to the cinema, spent time together. He notes that initially Inés was against it, but not openly. She behaved politely, but coldly. Gradually, the tension began to grow. Every time he came to Sofia's house, her aunt found a reason to intervene. She complained about the noise, picked on his manners, reproached him for unbelief. One day, he says, she directly told him that he was taking Sofia's light away. After that, she started sending him messages. They were strange, a mixture of religious quotes and threats. He saved them on an old phone, and these recordings were handed over to the investigators. In one of the messages, Inés wrote, "You don't understand that you are leading her to ruin. God has turned away from you, and she must understand this before it's too late." For the investigation, these messages became a turning point. They not only confirmed that Inés hated Mateo, but also showed how long ago her obsession had taken the form of a pervasive idea. This began long before Sofia's isolation, at least a year before her disappearance. Mateo provided an alibi for the entire period Sofia was missing. At that time, he was already living with another woman, and his whereabouts were confirmed by bank transactions, neighbors, and his employer. The check showed. His words matched the investigation data. No evidence linking him to Inés's house or the crime itself was found. Thus, the person Inés called the cause of sin turned out to be a witness, not an accomplice. Moreover, his testimony strengthened the prosecution's case. It was now clear that the idea of Sofia's purification did not appear suddenly, not under the influence of illness, but formed gradually, as a result of internal hatred and a control mania. The investigators included the correspondence with Mateo in the case materials. These records proved that Inés acted consciously, prepared, and sought justification for her actions. She had already created an image of an enemy in her mind and justified everything she later did with it. Officially, Mateo was recognized as a witness, and his testimony became an important element of the prosecution's base. For the prosecution, this was further confirmation that Inés not only believed in her righteousness, she deliberately led Sofia to isolation, convincing herself that she was doing it for salvation. Now the investigation had to move on to the last part, the trial, where all these details, documents, and testimonies had to come together into a single picture. The story, which began as a religious healing, now looked like a premeditated crime with cold calculation and deep personal motives. After interviewing witnesses and examining psychiatrists, investigators decided to go back to the very beginning, to Inés Ramirez's past. Before the events with Sofia, she lived a rather secluded life, but she had a record of working in medicine. This fact long seemed a formality until one of the investigators noticed the date of her dismissal, exactly 10 years ago. Her personnel file at the hospital contained a short explanation: resigned voluntarily. But experienced investigators knew that such phrases almost always concealed internal conflicts. The archived folder with personnel documents was requested. Among the reports, signatures, and medical orders, there was indeed a letter of termination. No remarks, no disciplinary actions. However, a couple of days later, investigators found something else, an internal memo marked for administration only. It featured Ramirez's surname and a short description of an incident: inadequate methods of patient treatment. To understand what this meant, investigators contacted Inés's former colleagues at the hospital. Many no longer worked there but agreed to testify. One of the senior orderlies, who had worked with her for several years, recalled a story that they preferred not to discuss publicly at the time. He said that Inés had once locked a ward door and refused to let anyone near a patient, claiming she was performing a spiritual procedure. The patient, a middle-aged man, was in the department with an acute mental disorder. Inez, according to her colleagues, was agitated that day. She insisted that the man was possessed and that medication would not help until there was a cleansing. When the medical staff tried to enter, she blocked the door from the inside and did not open it for almost an hour. Inside, according to eyewitnesses, she was reciting prayers and sprinkling him with tap water. After the incident, the patient was transferred to another department, and the hospital management decided not to publicize the story. At the time, they limited themselves to an internal reprimand and an offer to resign voluntarily to avoid public exposure. In the medical documentation, this case remained as an ethical violation without details. For the investigation, this was a revelation. Inez's past behavior fully mirrored what she later did with Sophia. Isolation, religious justification, the conviction that she was saving. The only difference was in scale. What 10 years ago was limited to an episode at work had now become a multi-year crime. The archived hospital report was added to the case materials as additional evidence. Legally, it could not replace direct evidence, but psychologically, it was key. It showed a stable pattern of behavior. Inez did not simply snap suddenly. Her actions had roots that went deep into the past. The investigator overseeing the case noted in his report, "The nature of the actions coincides. The object of the influence is chosen based on personal proximity and is perceived as a carrier of sin. The goal is isolation and subjugation under a religious pretext. The motive is a fanatic conviction of righteousness." This document became the missing piece that allowed the story to be connected into a cohesive chain. It was now obvious that the case with Sophia was not the result of an impulse, not an illness, and not an accident. It was the culmination of a long internal process where faith gradually turned into a tool of control. From this moment, the case took on new gravity. The investigation went beyond a single family drama. It now viewed Inez as a systemic offender capable of recurrence. This meant that the court would view her not as a fanatic, but as a dangerous person whose beliefs directly led to crime. The investigators understood. A trial was ahead. And what had previously seemed like a personal tragedy now became an example of how harmless faith can turn into dangerous obsession if not stopped in time. Before submitting the case to court, the investigator scheduled a final interrogation. Formally, it was to clarify details, but in reality, it was a last attempt to elicit a direct confession from Inez. The room was small, a metal table, 2 cameras, an observation window. Inez walked in calmly as if she had come for a meeting, not an interrogation. In the investigator's hands, all the materials were neatly laid out. Bank statements, expert reports, Mateo's testimony, a copy of an internal document from the hospital. Everything that had, over months of investigation, formed a clear system. The investigator began calmly. He laid out the first envelope. Bank transactions. Data appeared on the projector screen. For all 4 years that Sophia was listed as missing, monthly payments from her account continued to be deposited into Inez's card. In total, an amount equivalent to several years' salaries. Inez listened, not averting her gaze. When the investigator paused, she said softly, "Money is sin. I was saving her from it. It destroys the soul." The investigator didn't respond. He simply took out the next folder, the hospital report. Testimonies of colleagues who described how 10 years ago Inez locked a patient in a ward, claiming she was exorcising evil from him. He read an excerpt from the internal investigation. Personnel were denied access to the room. The patient was in a state of stress. Ramirez's actions were deemed unethical. Inez smirked. They understood nothing. The blind lead the blind. And I saw what they fear. Her voice was even, without irritation. Everything she said sounded not like a defense, but an explanation. as if in her worldview there was no contradiction between the law and her faith. She was convinced that she was acting correctly. The investigator continued. He took out a photograph, the only one they decided to show. It showed Sophia at the moment of her rescue. Emaciated, weakened, with a vacant stare. The photo was taken by forensics on the day the police were called. He placed the picture on the table and said nothing. This was the moment he had been counting on. Usually, even the most stubborn suspects cannot bear to see the consequences of their actions. But Inez's face did not change. She looked at the picture for a long time, then quietly pushed it back to the investigator. "This is not suffering," she said. "This is a path. To be cleansed, one must pass through pain. The body is perishable. I was saving her soul." The investigator made a note in the protocol. These words would later be included in the case materials almost verbatim. They would become a symbol that explaining what happened from the standpoint of ordinary logic was impossible. The interrogation continued for another hour. The investigator tried other approaches, asking clarifying questions, citing figures, reminding her of dates. Inez answered calmly and without contradictions, but every explanation she gave came down to one thing. Everything she did was not for herself. When asked why she didn't go to church, she replied, "The church is for those who seek. I already knew." Every new piece of evidence for her was not an argument, but a test of faith. She did not defend herself, did not make excuses, and did not try to mitigate her punishment. She had no goal of convincing the investigation of her innocence. She was convinced that the truth was already on her side. Towards the end of the interrogation, the investigator closed the folder. Formally, he had everything he needed. There was no confession, but there were words that were stronger than a confession. This was not repentance, not an explanation. It was the confession of a person completely detached from reality. These few hours of interrogation would be Inez's last contact with the police before the trial. After this, she would be transferred to a detention center where she would spend several months awaiting sentencing. The interrogation report would include a short note. Aware of the facts, unaware of their unlawfulness. The investigation concluded that convincing her was impossible, but from a legal standpoint, it was no longer necessary. All that remained was to gather the final documents and transfer the case to court. It was there that Inez Ramirez's story would finally be judged. When it seemed that the investigation was nearing its end and everything had been said, criminologists decided to conduct another, more in-depth examination of the evidence. It was almost a ritualistic step, a final check, more out of professional stubbornness than an expectation of discovery. But it is precisely at such moments that the most important findings occur. Among the many items seized from Inez's house, her old worn Bible was again on the table. It had been lying next to dusty folders for several months because, at first glance, it seemed simply a personal item. When the criminologist turned on ultraviolet light to check for traces, barely visible lines appeared in the margins of the book, as if someone had written with a pencil and then tried to erase it. Under normal light, they were almost invisible, but under the laboratory lamp they clearly emerged. The lines ran along the text in neat, small handwriting. Some words were underlined and numbers stood next to them. Experts took photographs, enhanced the contrast, and it became clear. These were not random notes, but dated entries. At first, no one could understand what these numbers meant. They looked like a sequence of days. But the further they progressed through the pages, the clearer it became. Inez was keeping something like a journal. To confirm this, a handwriting analysis was conducted. The result was unambiguous. It was the handwriting of Inez Ramirez. The investigators began to read, and what they saw turned the case from criminal to truly terrifying. On the pages were entries made over several years. Each date was accompanied by a short phrase. Sometimes it was only 3 or 4 words. Day 45. Refusal to eat. Pride. Further on, day 132. Confession incomplete. Lies in the eyes. A few more pages later, day 1150. Admitted first sin. Light is near. The further they read, the harder it became. All these years, Inez had been recording what was happening in the form of a spiritual report. She wasn't just keeping Sophia locked up. She was observing, analyzing, and recording, as if conducting an experiment. In her notes, there was no doubt, no compassion, no attempts to justify herself. Only rhythm and a dry structure. Day, action, reaction, result. The investigators realized before them was a cold-blooded diary. Not emotional notes, not internal prayers, but a consistent, systematic document. She had been keeping track all along, as if performing a purification program, and every line proved that this was not momentary madness. Everything that happened was planned, formalized as spiritual therapy. On the last page was an entry. Day 1482. Trial completed. Thank the Lord for the strength not to falter. Below this phrase, a neat signature and date. This entry coincided with the week when neighbors first heard strange sounds from the basement and called the police. For the investigation, this was a breakthrough. For the first time in the entire investigation, there was evidence that could not be interpreted in 2 ways. This was not a witness's opinion, not a diagnosis, not a guess. This was a confession, written in Inez's own hand. The Bible was carefully packaged, entered into the register of material evidence, and sent for examination. Evidence of this kind is rarely found. It combines a document, a personal confession, and a psychological portrait. Based on the analysis of the text, experts concluded the entries were made at different times, but with the same structure and rhythm. This confirms that Inez consciously chronicled her treatment throughout the entire period of isolation. Now the prosecution had a tool that could not be twisted. Neither faith, nor interpretations, nor defense arguments could change the fact. A person, aware of what they were doing, recorded the progress of their actions every day. This meant not a blackout, not an accident, but calculation. This discovery was the final point in the investigation. After the diary appeared, everything became obvious. Inez was not just performing actions, she was building a system. And this meant that the court would have to consider not only the crime, but also the ideology behind it. When Inez was brought back to the interrogation room, the atmosphere was already different. Now the investigation had no guesses, no theories, only facts, recorded in her own hand. On the table before her lay that very book. A worn cover, faded pages, but now it was no longer a symbol of faith, but evidence. The investigator carefully opened it to a page with pencil marks, made in faint but recognizable handwriting. A few seconds of silence, only the rustle of papers and the muffled hum of the lamp. "Are these your notes?" the investigator asked, not raising his voice. She looked at the pages for a long time, almost calmly, as if she saw before her not evidence, but something personal, sacred. There was no fear in her gaze, no attempt to justify herself. There was only certainty, a strange feeling of her own righteousness. Then she slowly nodded. "Yes," she replied softly. "I wrote this." The investigator made a note but remained silent. He didn't interrupt. Inez continued on her own as if afraid her words might be misinterpreted. "This is not a diary of a crime," she said. "This is a path. I kept it to remember what we went through. This is not evidence. This is the chronicle of her healing. There was no falsity in her voice, not a single intonation that could indicate a lie or despair. She spoke as if she was sure that everyone around her simply didn't understand, that she had done nothing wrong. Every entry in the book, according to her, was a step on the path to purification. Every date. Proof of faith, not guilt. The investigator turned the page. Under the lamp, lines emerged. Day 986. Silent. The trial continues. He read aloud, slowly as if checking her reaction. Inez listened and nodded. Yes, I wrote that. We had to go through silence. Only in silence can one hear God. He showed another page. Day 1450. The trial is complete. Is this yours too? The investigator clarified. Mine, she replied calmly. And everything there is true. Legally, this was enough. With this one confession, she confirmed not only the authorship of the entries, but also the actual commission of all the actions described in them. And even if in her mind these lines meant something different, for the investigation, it was a cold and direct admission. Every date, every stroke, proof of systematic actions, stretched over time, committed with full awareness. The investigator closed the book but left it on the table. He asked no more questions. Everything had been said, and Inez's words sounded louder than any confessions. Her attempt to explain everything with faith turned into her sealing her own accusation. When Inez was led out of the room, she turned to the investigator and said, "You don't understand. You judge the flesh, and I judged the soul." He said nothing. A short entry would appear in the interrogation report. The accused confirmed the authenticity of the evidence, showed no remorse, does not dispute the content of the entries. This was enough. The Bible was packed into a separate envelope. Her confession made the document final evidence, undeniable, legally sound, emotionally devastating. Now no one could say it was fiction or someone's conjecture. Everything that happened was recorded by Inez herself, and she did not deny it. For the investigation, this was the end, a logical conclusion to which everything led. The motive was known, the evidence confirmed, the testimonies recorded. Now the case was ready for court. Everything that began with an anonymous call and an old house on the outskirts had turned into a complete, documented accusation. And ahead was the final stage. A public hearing where Inez Ramirez would appear not as a fanatical relative, but as a person whose actions would be judged by law, not by faith. When the investigation completed the diary analysis and interrogations, it was time to reconstruct the chronology of events. Investigators meticulously recreated the first day, the one that began Sophia's 4-year isolation. To do this, they used the victim's own testimony, fragments of Inez's notes, and expert data. The resulting scenario left no room for coincidence. Everything that happened had been planned in advance. According to Sophia, she was in a vulnerable state at the time. After an argument with her parents, she left home, not knowing where to go. Inez offered her to stay, for a while, until things settled down. To the family, it seemed natural. Her aunt had always seemed a reliable and calm woman, a person with a medical background who could be trusted. No one could have predicted that this very trust would become a trap. The first day at Inez's house, according to Sophia's recollections, seemed ordinary. Comfort, tea in the kitchen, a conversation about life. The hostess seemed genuinely willing to help. She spoke a lot about Sophia needing to clear her head, rest from the world, stop chasing false pleasures. These phrases did not seem alarming then, just moralizing from an older person. But now, after reading the diary, each of them sounds like part of a script. In the evening, Inez suggested Sophia relax, take a bath to wash away anxiety and start anew. The words were simple, mundane, but they contained the first stage of her plan. While Sophia was bathing, the door was ajar. Everything seemed normal. Then Inez quietly went into the hallway and locked the door from the outside. She didn't slam the door, didn't say a word. Only a minute later, when Sophia noticed that the door wouldn't open, did she hear a voice from behind the door. According to Sophia's recollections, Inez said calmly, almost tenderly, "The treatment has begun." These two words marked the beginning of 4 years of isolation. At that moment, Sophia thought it was some strange joke. She laughed, called out, asked to be let out, but there was no answer. Inez didn't speak to her again that evening. Only in the morning did she bring water and tell her that she needed to think about her actions. Subsequent events, established by the investigation, confirm the crime was premeditated. Traces of fresh installation were found on the lock. Screws and hinges had been replaced a few days before the incident. A receipt was found in the documents of a nearby store. Inez had indeed bought hardware and tools matching those found in the house. This proves that by the time Sophia arrived, the plan already existed. Investigators meticulously reconstructed the scheme. Isolation began with a mundane situation that seemed safe. There were no threats, no use of force, only trust, which turned into a tool of control. This moment is key to the entire reconstruction. The crime was not born from a fit of rage, but from cold calculation. The investigation concluded. It all began with a betrayal of trust. Inez used Sophia's most vulnerable state, confusion and the need for support, and turned it into a means of subjugation. This episode will become the central element of the indictment. At the court session, the reconstruction of the first day will be presented almost frame by frame. The court will be shown a diagram of the house, the position of the locks, timestamps from the diary, and Sophia's words recorded during the interrogation. All this will form the basis of the claim of premeditation, because no accidental act can be so meticulously prepared. Thus, the investigation definitively established the crime did not begin the moment Inez locked the door, but much earlier, when she first offered Sophia to stay with her to be cleansed. It was then that the plan moved from conception to action. And this reconstruction will be key in the case, determining not only guilt, but also the measure of punishment. The trial of Inez Ramirez began in early autumn. In the courtroom, there was a minimal audience, a few journalists, representatives of the prosecution, and the defense. The atmosphere was restrained but tense. By this point, the story had already spread through local news and caused public outcry. No one expected that in the quiet suburb of Buenos Aires, a story more akin to a nightmare than a real crime could have occurred. From the outset, the judge noted that the case was unprecedented. It combined two dimensions, legal and moral. On the one hand, specific charges, unlawful deprivation of liberty, fraud, causing grievous bodily harm. On the other, what cannot be measured by legal formulations: faith, fanaticism, power over another person. The prosecution built its case clearly and point by point. All collected evidence was used: Sophia's testimony, the diary, entries from the Bible, financial reports, expert conclusions. Criminologists confirmed the systematic nature of the actions, from installing the lock on the door to distributing monetary transfers. Witnesses, Inez's former colleagues, a neighbor, and Mateo, added a human dimension. Each of them had seen a piece of her life, but only now did these fragments come together into a complete picture. The defense built its case differently. They did not dispute the facts, but insisted on the motivation. According to the lawyer, Inez was unaware of the criminal nature of her actions, believing she was acting for good. The lawyers appealed to medical conclusions, to a religious disorder bordering on delusion. They argued that it was not evil but delusion, not greed, but distorted faith. The prosecutor responded calmly but firmly. He pointed out that over all the years, Inez had not shown the slightest remorse, that the money she received continued to be deposited into her account, that there was not a single entry in the diary about doubt, only about control and purification. He emphasized the consistency of her actions, her calculation, and cold-bloodedness. His words sounded especially heavy when a page from the diary appeared on the screen with the inscription, Day 1450. The trial is complete. The courtroom fell silent. Inez sat calmly, without visible emotion. When the judge offered her the last word, she stood up without hesitation. She spoke evenly, confidently, looking straight ahead. I do not recognize earthly judgment. I answer only to God. Everything I did was in the name of light. You will not understand this. These words became her final statement. They contained no remorse, only conviction in her own righteousness. To the jury, this sounded like a rejection of human logic. After the final session, the court retired for deliberation. There was silence in the room, only the rustle of papers. Almost 2 hours passed. When the judges returned, no one doubted the outcome. The verdict was read without emotion, in an official tone. Inez Ramirez is found guilty on all counts of the indictment. The court imposed a sentence of 15 years of imprisonment in a general regime correctional facility. Additionally, it was ordered to recover the illegally obtained funds and compensate the victim for damages. At the moment of the announcement, Inez did not react. She did not cry, did not look around. She merely smiled quietly, as if this outcome had been known to her in advance. Sophia was absent from the courtroom. By court decision, she had given her testimony behind closed doors and was not present at the verdict reading. At this stage, the legal part of the story concludes. Justice is formally restored, but a sense of complete closure never comes. In Inez Ramirez's case, too much falls outside the scope of the law, where fanaticism intertwines with faith, and power over another person becomes a personal dogma. Soon after the verdict, the case was closed and transferred to the archive, but its copies, photographs, and investigation materials would continue to be used for a long time in legal seminars and criminal psychology courses. Because this is that rare case where a crime is not just committed. It grows out of the conviction that evil can be justified by good intentions. And that is what makes it truly terrifying. After the verdict was announced, Inez Ramirez spent several more weeks in solitary confinement before being transferred to a women's correctional facility near Cordoba. Her journey from the courthouse to the institution's gates took less than 24 hours. But in effect, it was the end of an entire life. She showed no signs of hysteria or attempts at resistance. She walked calmly with the same expression she had worn when listening to the verdict, as if she were not going to prison, but to a place where, as she herself said, purification begins. In the colony, she was given a separate cell due to her status, a nurse convicted of a particularly serious crime. According to the guards, Inez spends most of her time in prayer, does not participate in communal work, and rarely speaks. Letters that journalists attempted to send her were returned unopened. Sophia, meanwhile, completed a long rehabilitation. Physically, she recovered quickly, but the psychological work proved infinitely more complex. Several months under medical supervision, then a gradual return to normal life. According to the investigation, it took her more than a year to go out alone for the first time. She avoids attention, does not give interviews, and does not comment on the case. All that is known is that after her discharge, she changed her surname, moved to another city, and tries to keep a low profile. The house where it all happened was put up for sale immediately after the trial. The address was not specified in the advertisement to avoid crowds of curious onlookers. Unofficially, the buyer acquired it at a reduced price and completely rebuilt it. Internal partitions were demolished, windows replaced, the facade repainted. Nothing remained of its former appearance. Local residents say that a family with 2 adult sons now lives there, and no one even suspects the story hidden behind those walls. But the old neighbors still avoid that area at night. They say it's too quiet there. Psychologists involved in the process later noted, Inez's case became a classic example of religious fanaticism taken to a pathological form. Several universities included the case materials in their courses on criminal psychiatry and ethics. In the press, it was called Ramirez's syndrome, when a person possessing medical education places themselves above professional and human morality, justifying any action by faith. Legally, the story concluded. All documents, protocols, reports in the archive. The court decision came into force, and for the state, it is a closed case. But for Sophia, it will never end. The consequences of such events are not erased by time. They simply change form. Someone loses a life. Someone. Faith in it. Several years have passed, but even today, Inez Ramirez's name occasionally resurfaces in Argentinian media. Some remember her as a madwoman, others as a warning that evil rarely looks like a monster. It can be quiet, caring, smiling, and that is why it is the most dangerous. This story set a precedent. After it, the country changed the rules for checking personnel working with vulnerable people. Additional requirements for the psychiatric evaluation of specialists were enshrined at the legislative level. But for those who studied this case, its main value is not in laws, but in the reminder that evil does not come from outside. It is born from a person's conviction that they know better than others what is good. Many believe that being around other people provides protection through public attention. Statistics confirm this theory, but one should not forget that evildoers can use various tricks to lure someone to a secluded place. Therefore, it is important to remain vigilant even in crowded places. In picturesque Andria, an Italian city with about 100,000 inhabitants, the story of the local Mansi family attracted public attention. The city was famous for its historical heritage, especially for the majestic Castel del Monte castle, which attracted many travelers daily. For the locals, tourism became the main source of income. Not far from the famous castle lived the Mansi family, the parents and their only long-awaited daughter, Graziella. For the last 10 years, the family owned a small commercial shop, conveniently located on the way to the main gate of the castle. Here they offered tourists nuts and dried fruits. Trade was successful. Graziella, despite her age, often helped in the family business, which made her parents very happy. There were always many visitors on the busy tourist street, and extra hands were very welcome. The young woman happily participated in the joint business and attracted customers with her friendliness and energy. Saturday, August 19th, 2000, was no different from ordinary weekends with their maximum tourist crowds. On such days, Graziella's grandfather often stood behind the counter. His granddaughter enjoyed keeping him company and running small errands. Due to the constant stream of visitors, the grandfather rarely left the shop. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, the tired old man asked his granddaughter to go to the fountain and fill a small bottle with water. Graziella willingly agreed and set off for the fountain, which was only 5 minutes away. Time passed, but Graziella did not return. The grandfather began to worry, although he initially calmed himself with the thought that his granddaughter might have met acquaintances and got into a conversation. However, when more than 20 minutes had passed and Graziella, who was always punctual, did not appear, the man became seriously alarmed. He decided to check the situation and went to the fountain. To his surprise and concern, Graziella was nowhere to be found, neither there nor in the neighboring streets, which he thoroughly searched for his granddaughter. The situation became increasingly tense. When the grandfather returned to the shop hoping to find Graziella, he realized that she still had not appeared. She could have taken another way, but she was nowhere to be seen. After about 30 minutes, he contacted the son and mother and began calling all friends and acquaintances whose numbers he had noted down. The parents also called everyone they could reach, but no one had seen her. Soon, the entire family and some of Graziella's friends gathered at the Mansi shop in the square. Without wasting time, adults and young people organized search parties. Their activity attracted the attention of passers-by and tourists, many of whom immediately joined the search. The relatives brought a photo of Graziella and showed it to passers-by. Some confirmed seeing her during the day and in the evening. However, no one could say where she had gone or what might have happened. The area was considered quiet. Incidents rarely occurred here. It seemed unimaginable that something could happen in such a busy place. After several hours of unsuccessful searching, the Mansi family contacted the local police. The officers immediately joined the search. After some time, a local resident approached one of the patrol officers with disturbing information. He had heard a scream from the wooded area near Castel del Monte Castle. 2 carabinieri went in the indicated direction and noticed smoke rising from the center of the plantation. Initially, they did not connect this with the disappearance, but decided to check the source of the fire and assess the need for firefighter intervention. As they approached the location to about 10 meters, the police officers noticed an unusual smell. The source of the fire looked strange. Under a layer of dry leaves, they noticed something disturbing. Due to the size and clothing which matched the description of Graziella's outfit, the police officers had to reluctantly realize that their worst fears had been confirmed. When they discovered the crime scene, it was already too late to change anything. During the investigation of the wooded area, investigators discovered several fragments of clothing and a device for starting fires, the presumed source of the fire. No further clues about the perpetrators were found. A more thorough examination of the area was required. The authorities also hoped to obtain recordings from surveillance cameras installed near the castle. The medical examination confirmed the identity of the found person. It was Graziella Mansi. The specialists could not fully answer all the questions of the investigation and the family. The condition complicated the investigation, but the expert opinion confirmed the deliberate nature of the incident. The information about this incident spread like wildfire through news channels. The next day, press representatives literally besieged the Mansi family home. When the relatives were informed about what had happened, they initially refused to believe that it was Graziella. This inexplicable case shook the residents so much that the entire district was in a state of shock. The media reported intensively on the incident near the famous castle. Society was disturbed by what had happened. The flow of tourists significantly decreased. Visitors considered the area unsafe and avoided the attraction, which negatively affected Andria's tourism sector. The investigators acted quickly. The police were actively involved in the work from the very first hours. The main theory was that a perpetrator led Graziella from the hiking trail to a deserted place and then set a fire to cover up the tracks. There could obviously be no serious adversaries in Graziella's environment, so they looked for an adult. The investigation pursued several versions. Initially, they checked the lists of people with criminal pasts who could be in the region. However, this line of inquiry gradually lost its significance. Even tourist data was examined. It was assumed that the perpetrator could be a traveler who selected random passers-by. Over time, this version also seemed increasingly unlikely. During the questioning of witnesses, friends, and acquaintances of the Mansi family, the name Pasquale Tartoro was mentioned more and more often. This 20-year-old young man was known throughout the area. He worked unofficially as a parking attendant on the street where the Mansi family's shop was located. Many noticed Pasquale's strange behavior. Since Graziella began helping in her relative's shop, he constantly watched her. His gaze disturbed the surroundings. Several witnesses pointed out this circumstance, which attracted the special attention of the investigators. The authorities' conversations with Pasquale's friends confirmed the unsettling suspicions. The question arose, could Pasquale be an obsessed stalker? The relatives categorically rejected this possibility. According to them, he grew up in a sheltered family and never had conflicts with the law, at least until that fateful evening in Castel del Monte. Despite his relatives' assurances, however, Pasquale became the main person in the case. At the meeting with the investigators, suspicions only intensified. His t-shirt was stained with suspicious dark red spots and dirt, as if he had been digging in the ground for a long time. Traces of resistance were visible on his face. The investigators noted that the scratches were superficial, as if left by delicate fingers. Pasquale denied his involvement in the disappearance of a person, but the longer the conversations with the investigators lasted, the more frequently his version of events changed. After several hours at the police station, Pasquale began to give in. His statement about Graziella's beauty, this is how he spoke about the schoolgirl, caused particular concern among the investigators. Many inconsistencies accumulated in the suspect's accounts, who was obviously trying to hide something from the police. In one version, Pasquale claimed he was accidentally in that forest during a walk, where he saw a motionless person. Frightened, he ran away, and shortly thereafter the police appeared. Later, his story was supplemented with new details. He recounted how he met Graziella at the fountain, where she had come to fetch water. She was not afraid of him. She had often seen him before. Until that day, he always appeared calm and appropriate. Pasquale confessed that he lured her into the forest with a story about puppies, allegedly recently born to a local dog. When he was finally cornered, he confessed to the incident, claiming he wanted to cover his tracks. The young man insisted that there were no other motives, calling what happened an out-of-control game. The media actively highlighted every detail of the incident, adding rumors and unverified details. This created confusion. The true motives of the perpetrator remained unclear. The story with Pasquale's statements took an unexpected turn. Law enforcement tried to get a credible version of events. There were many inconsistencies in his story, obvious contradictions with the evidence found. Although he shared the details of the events and other important information with the Carabinieri, many key questions about the incident and its causes remained unanswered. It was determined that the fire started around 10 o'clock at night, but the disappearance was noticed almost 3 hours earlier. What happened during all this time? Pasquale explained his actions by saying that he heard voices. People were passing by near the forest. He thought the search for the missing person had begun. The medical expert's report caused particular concern. In his opinion, Graziella Mansi was conscious at the time of the fire. The Carabinieri continued to work with the suspect. Questions arose as to why he only had insignificant scratches under these circumstances. Doubts arose that he acted alone. There might have been other participants. It was decided to conduct another interrogation. Finally, Pasquale agreed to cooperate with the investigators and tell the truth that he had previously concealed out of fear. According to his words, he did not take Graziella into the forest on his own initiative. A group of young men aged 18 to 20 forced him to do so. In the forest, Giuseppe De Bari, Vincenzo Caratello, Domenico Margiotto, and Michele Zagaria were waiting. Pasquale claimed that originally there were no other intentions. He had a conflict with these young men, in which he lost. As compensation, the acquaintances demanded he bring Graziella into the forest, which he did. The 4 young men held Graziella for several hours. When they heard the search calls, they became afraid of the consequences. The group decided to hide the traces of the incident. They had no suitable materials to cover up the evidence. When Graziella came to and started screaming, the The young men panicked and tried to use force. Finally, they covered her with leaves and tried to think about how to hide their actions, after which they decided to use an ignition device. All those involved were between 18 and 20 years old. As it turned out, the young men came from affluent families and not from a troubled background, which made their act even more incomprehensible. Acquaintances described them as well-balanced and sensible young people who had never shown aggression or a propensity for legal violations. Only one of them had minor problems with the law in the past, a minor theft. According to Pasquale's statements, law enforcement quickly arrested the entire group. The news shook all of Italy and received widespread media attention. Since their arrest, the suspects denied any involvement in Graziella's disappearance, asserting that they did not understand the reasons for the authorities' interest in them. However, the investigators were determined to continue their work until they reconstructed the complete picture of the events of that evening in the forest. During the investigation of these young men, unlike Pasquale, investigators found no visible traces of the incident. Their clothes were clean, and they had no injuries. Searches of their homes yielded no results. Nothing suspicious was found. During interrogations, they persistently maintained their innocence, but confirmed that Pasquale Tartoro did indeed harbor strange feelings for Graziella. Despite long conversations with the investigators, none of them changed their statement. At this point, they were released but remained under surveillance as suspects. An interesting detail later came to light. These 4 young men were among those who carried the ceremonial coffin at Graziella's farewell. This happened even before Pasquale made his statement. Eyewitnesses reported that the young men showed sincere emotions as if they were experiencing deep sorrow. During interrogations, they explained their reaction by saying that they knew Graziella, albeit not closely, but they often saw her at the Mansis family business. The investigators developed the theory that the presence of all 4 at the ceremony was not a coincidence. Despite lacking close acquaintance with the family, they might have felt internal discomfort or tried to understand how far the investigations had progressed and whether there were suspicions against them. The ceremony gathered almost the entire city. Even some tourists came. In such a crowd, 4 emotional young men did not attract particular attention. When they were asked back to the station, each was spoken to individually. Vincenzo and Giuseppe claimed to have an alibi. They stated that on the day of the disappearance, around 7 o'clock in the evening, they were at the local gaming club. Michele and Domenico, however, refused to speak to the investigators and demanded the presence of lawyers. This behavior only increased the interest of law enforcement in these individuals. The investigators began verifying Vincenzo and Giuseppe's alibi. Their presence was confirmed at the computer club, but only for the first hour. The friends' further whereabouts remained unknown, raising questions for the investigative authorities. The case took an unexpected turn when Michele and Domenico decided to tell their version of events. Their story largely matched Pasquale Tartoro's statements. According to them, the friends met in the forest in the evening, allegedly for a game. By the time they arrived, the whole group was already there. Pasquale was supposed to bring Graziella. The other participants hid behind trees, waiting for their appearance. It took them about 15 to 20 minutes to reach the forest. At this time, the grandfather had probably already begun searching for his granddaughter. When they arrived at the spot, the other participants jumped out of their hiding places. Graziella was trapped. The group was under the influence of alcohol. They were amused by how much Graziella was frightened. According to the arrested individuals, they only wanted to play with the defenseless Graziella. Graziella was so frightened that she became paralyzed. At one point, the situation got out of control. After the fall, she lost consciousness. The young people claimed they had originally only intended to scare her. When she stopped responding, everyone realized the seriousness of the situation. At that moment, they heard voices, presumably from those searching for Graziella. Under the influence of alcohol, they decided to cover up the traces of the incident. The suspect's statements were partially confirmed by evidence. The medical examination proved ambiguous. There were certain injuries on Graziella, but their exact nature could not be determined. The young woman's clothing was in place, which questioned some initial investigative theories. The difficulty also lay in the fact that the traces of fire damage significantly hampered the work of experts. The Carabinieri suspected that the group of young people might have intentionally used flames to hide the traces of their actions. The story of the dangerous game told by the arrested individuals raised serious doubts. The investigators carefully examined all circumstances of the incident, trying to establish the true course of events. Meanwhile, the arrested continued to claim that everything happened by chance. The final decision was to be made by the court. Two from the group, Vincenzo and Giuseppe, categorically denied their involvement. According to them, they simply came to the forest at Pasquale's invitation, without suspecting his intentions. When they saw what was happening, they allegedly left immediately. The young men explained that they did not contact the police out of fear of possible revenge from the other participants or problems with the law. They could have been accused of complicity. After the completion of the court proceedings, Pasquale Tartoro received a relatively lenient sentence, 30 years in prison. Two factors contributed to this: his willingness to cooperate with the investigators and the fact that the expertise did not confirm his direct involvement in the final events. The other 4 participants received a stricter sentence. For the kidnapping of a minor and intentional acts, they received life imprisonment in solitary cells, without the right to contact other inmates. The sentencing sparked strong reactions. Graziella's mother lost consciousness. Her husband needed help. An argument erupted between the families of the accused. The young woman's relatives considered the punishment just, except in Pasquale's case. In their opinion, he deserved a harsher sentence. Vincenzo and Giuseppe were particularly active in opposing the court decision. They defended their innocence so convincingly that they even found supporters who believed their version of events. However, this did not help them to challenge the verdict. 8 years after these events, 27-year-old Vincenzo Caratello made a fateful decision during his stay in the correctional facility. Perhaps guilt plagued him, or he simply saw no other way out. Just a few days earlier, his mother had visited him. The woman continued to believe unwaveringly in her son's innocence and supported him in every way. However, Vincenzo himself had at this point already lost all will to continue his path. The mother's heart felt that something was wrong. She noticed that her son had become distant, had become a different person, and her premonitions proved correct. On June 19th, 2013, lawyer Michel filed a motion for a review of the case, citing procedural violations. He challenged the results of the previous proceedings, but the court refused to consider the motion. Pasquale's mother publicly extended her sincere apologies to the Mansi family for her son's actions. She emphasized that he must take full responsibility for his deeds before the law. However, Graziella's mother rejected these apologies. Her response was emotional. She stated that Pasquale must go through everything her daughter had endured. According to her, Graziella would have remained with her family had he not lured her into the forest. Graziella's parents considered Pasquale to be the main culprit. The name Graziella Mansi is not forgotten in Italy. At Castel del Monte Castle, there is a memorial plaque with her photo and a short story of Graziella, whose path ended so early. This place became a kind of memorial, where locals and tourists leave flowers and plush toys. Graziella's relatives frequently visit this place of remembrance. After 24 years of imprisonment, Pasquale Tartoro regained his freedom. For good behavior, his sentence was reduced by 6 years. He is now 44 and is trying to start a new life. It is difficult to predict how his future fate will unfold. Among all those involved, he was the only one who agreed to a simplified procedure, which led to a reduction in sentence. After the incident, all parties broke off all contact with each other. Even when Pasquale was released, none of his former friends tried to re-establish contact. He himself says that every day he remembers what happened and the pain he inflicted on Graziella and her loved ones. Pasquale confesses, if he could go back in time, he would act differently. In the difficult rehabilitation phase, his family became his most important support. He expresses his gratitude to everyone who believed in his recovery. However, Graziella's mother expressed her opinion about Pasquale's early release. According to her, his release undermined the idea of justice. She is convinced that such people cannot change and pose a danger to society, which is why they do not deserve a second chance. Vincenzo and Giuseppe, who insisted on their innocence, could not understand Pasquale's motives. In his last letter before leaving this world, Vincenzo continued to defend his innocence and expressed his bitterness about the injustice of the system. He hoped that one day someone would come forward to prove the truth, but he himself saw no more point in continuing the fight for freedom. Giuseppe, Domenico, and Michele are still in custody. Giuseppe does not give up his attempts to prove his innocence and dedicates his time to studying the Bible. He has accepted his verdict and no longer files appeals. In doing so, he maintains the belief that the truth will one day come to light. All three unanimously point to Pasquale as the main culprit of the incident. According to them, he lured Graziella into the forest and was the initiator of the subsequent events. Nevertheless, Pasquale received the mildest sentence among all the convicted and is already free.